Okay, we're going to be talking about the Oxford group in this next session, but several thoughts occurred to me in the luncheon break. I had the pleasure of sitting with a man who talked more about God than anybody at the table, and announced that he was Jewish, and so I want to make a comment about that from the Bible. And also, he was saying that, which is a conventional thing, which I did with desperation, and that is that he had done what he was told to do, and then he was explaining how happy his life was, and that God had done for him what he couldn't do for himself. As far as I'm concerned, that's an awful good message. And what I think, although he has stuck out, I think he's walking now, which is good for you. He stuck out the seminar. There can be a reaction, well, who cares about this? If I just do what I'm told, I'll get what they got. And I would like to say that probably underlying the Big Book Seminar approach, when they say what's wrong is not the program, it's the fellowship. What does that mean? Well, to me, in terms of this seminar, it means this. There's nothing wrong with the message. I don't have any problem with the Big Book. I don't have any problem with the 12 steps. I took them, I apply them, I study them, and I teach them, and I try to understand more all the time. I would say it's not the message that should bring us here. It's that we want to be better messengers. And think about this. As long as you understand the Big Book and understand the steps and perhaps do all the other stuff that most of us had to do to get here and get better, which is to say all the things, going to meetings and involving yourselves in commitments and service and sponsoring newcomers and trying to practice the steps and communicating and hanging out with the winners and blah, 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 blah. I certainly did that with a vengeance. And I'm here, and as I said at the beginning of this, I'm here because I came into AA, and sick though I was, and imperfect though I was in my proceedings in AA, I nonetheless did what I was told. But the problem for me was that I often wasn't told something that I could understand very well. And when you figure this, you may or may not have come here. One of the guys at the table was saying, how'd you come here? I came here because I was at the end of the road and nobody sent me here. Ironically, my ex-wife, whom I didn't like very well, and I'm not sure I still am crazy about her, but she was the one that said, why don't you try AA? And I did. And I didn't know what I was getting into or what I was supposed to do. And I got some bum advice, but I pretty much followed all of it. And I started in AA, and yes, I went to a treatment center for 30 days, but I was so sick they could have said anything. As long as they fed me and strapped me down, I was okay. And then I got out and I couldn't handle life, so I went to the VA psych ward. And as long as they fed me and they didn't have to strap me down, but the point, I just about needed custodial care. And it was after that I began with a little bit clearer mind to understand the program. Now consider some factors that are feeding people into AA today. Probation officers. Lots of our people are coming in. Somebody said to me in Pittsburgh, do you people object to people getting court cards signed? And I said, heck no. I recommend to my sponsees before they ever get to court to start getting a record of their participation, because judges need to be educated, lawyers need to be educated, and the probation officer will smile. One of the reasons I'm not a felon today is because my felonies were reduced to misdemeanors on the basis of the work that I did with my probation officer, and the judge under the California law reduced my felonies to misdemeanors. I remember I sent that to Frank M. a long time back. I was so naive I thought he'd be interested, and he was. He said, "Congratulations, Dick." But you see, we got to educate people, I believe, because the people that are referring us to Alcoholics Anonymous don't know sickum about it. They don't know what a step is. They don't know what a big book is. They know that they should send you to meetings. This judge of the drug court that was in Pittsburgh said, "Meetings, meetings, I love meetings." Well, sure, it gets him out of his hair. But how much better it would be if he knew all about the steps in the Bible and, blah, blah, blah. Hey, this guy's got a big caseload. So if the message, or the people that are sending prospects, if you will, into AA don't know why they're sending us, then we better know what the message is. And similarly, the therapist, the person who has 27 years and they say, "Oh, yeah, I was in AA. There's a doctor out there. I try to send all my people to him so they won't die." And he's fond of saying, "I've been in the program for 23 years," and he whispers something about the steps, and I've never seen him at a meeting. What does he know about the program? I don't know. I'm awful glad he's there to keep him from having seizures and die. But the therapist that you've never seen at a meeting, now, oddly enough, on Maui, there are a lot of therapists that are at the meetings. But the point is, AA, in one sense, may be no better than the people who send us here, because they have different conceptions. And if you come in with that, I lost a sponsee who, by the way, has been sober for 9 years now. But when he came to me, he said, "I've got a therapist." And he said, "She told me to go to AA." And I said, "Good, must be a good therapist." And I said, "Call me every day," which is not going to keep him sober, but it might keep him committed. And he says, "No, I'm not going to call you every day. I have to call my therapist every day." Come on. Did she send him to AA, or did she send him to AA to get insurance? Or why did she send him to AA? So whether it's the therapist or the prison or the doctor, and worst of all, perhaps the clergyman, he sends you to AA. You've been disrupting his congregation for 10 years. I did. Boy, I was not a welcome creature on the phone with my preacher. It was painful, and his old man had gotten sober in AA. He never told me to go to AA. But if he had, he'd been glad to get rid of me. And I don't think he liked AA very well because he didn't like his old man. So these are, a lot of the referral sources are not sending anybody here and say, "You're going to establish a relationship with God in AA." Did you know that? I never heard a judge say that. Never heard a probation officer. I'm not sure many therapists would say that. If somebody calls himself a Christian counselor, what does he mean? Does he mean that he's doing Christian teaching with his counselees, or does he mean that he goes to the Methodist Church on Sundays? I don't know. So one of the important reasons, I believe, is that as this message gets passed down, how many people are around that still knew Dr. Bob? Just about nobody at this point. They have this gathering of the Eagles. You realize if you got 50 years of sobriety, you don't know Dr. Bob. This old gal that I wrote this book about, Hope, Geraldine D., she's 90 years old and 50 years sober, and she knew Bill Wilson. And the message that she carries from Bill Wilson is not the message that's in the big book. She says, "He said, sit down, shut up, and listen." Well, he probably did. But before that, he wrote the big book and the 12 Steps. And, she's out of touch, been out of touch with Bill Wilson. So there aren't very many people that can still say, "I knew Dr. Bob, and he said." That's what they used to say a lot. So if we don't get the message straight, somebody else will twist it. And if you believe in the devil, and I do, he's one of the prime twisters. But in addition to that, so will a lot of people that just want to shoot their mouths off. Alcoholics like to talk. And they don't always say a great deal. They talk a lot, but it's easy to get all of these strange things that we hear in meetings that didn't come from AA. So I would hope that one of the points of, I made a point of knowing that big book. And I made a point of knowing those steps. And I made a point of trying to get it straight so that I could pass it on straight. But the messengers that are coming in, AA in one sense is no stronger than the sponsor. And if any of you are sponsoring, I would think there's some value in understanding where faith without works is dead comes from. My sponsor had me start the fourth step by writing down faith without works is dead. It's not in the fourth step. What did it mean to him? I don't know. What did it mean to me? I don't know. I was too sick, so I just wrote down faith without works is dead and did the fourth step. When my sponsees do the fourth step, I don't say anything about faith without works is dead. I just say after the third step, it says action, 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 and do it at once and get busy, and then I explain a little bit about the origins. Why not? They heard it in early AA. The second is just a word, and this isn't any theological dissertation. What do I know about the Jewish people? But one of the interesting things is if you want to get inspired, get a winning friend who's Jewish. I did. This guy always used his full name. Hi, I'm Seymour Weinberg. I'm an alcoholic. And that guy did more talking about God and more praying, and he was a pillar of my strength in that first year. He was the guy. The Christians were scared to death. They were secret agents, but not Seymour. You know, he knew where he stood, and he knew what he did about it, and it was cool. Well, you know, this goes way back. We were talking about receivers. Do you think the Jewish people didn't have a receiver? God put it on them for a reason. And if I can find out what I'm talking about, it started with Abraham, the so-called father of believers. And if I can't find it, I'll wing it. Genesis 15, verse 6. Abraham believed the Lord, and he, God, credited it to him as righteousness. The Jews followed the law, but Abraham became the father because he was a believer of God, and he was called a friend of God. There weren't many people around that were believing God in those days, but the Jewish people did, or Judeans, or whatever you want to call them. And they, because of their believing God, it was counted to them as salvation, if you will. And when God wanted to speak to the holy men of old, which is how most of the Bible was written, He's put the Spirit of God upon them and could speak to them, and they had a receiving set. They were God's chosen people because they were the only ones around that were doing what they were supposed to be doing. The rest of them were called Gentiles, barbarians, Greeks, blah, blah, blah. And I was looking for this, and thank goodness this Bible was in my room, and I was looking for that, I will be your God and you'll be my people, and I found it. Leviticus, you need a big book concordance and you need a Bible concordance. Because when you want to find something, make it easy on yourself. Don't reinvent the wheel. So I found a concordance, and I looked up, I will be your God and you'll be my people. And he's talking about the Jewish people. Leviticus 26, verse 12. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. A lot of us have heard the old songs, let my people go, and so forth. They were called God's people because they were His people. Now, sometimes they weren't very nice people, just like Christians aren't. And when they weren't very nice, they caught it. Big time. And when they were nice, they were God's obedient kids. And boy, He took care of old Noah, and He took care of Moses, and about 2 million of them that were moving out of Egypt and had a bunch of Egyptians on their back. And the whole Bible in the Old Testament is filled with messages from God. That's one of the arguments that the Oxford group used to use, and Shoemaker. One of the reasons we believe in guidance of God, he said, is that the Old Testament is filled with as many examples of it as you please. It's all about God speaking to His people. But what people? Just anybody? No. His people. Those people that believed in Him. Enough of that, I guess. Okay, now, here we are into this Bookmanist crowd. The Oxford Group. How important is it? Well, Bill Wilson wrote, "Now that Frank Buchman is gone, and I realize more than ever what we owe to him, I wish I'd sought him out in the recent years to tell him of our appreciation." But he was still scared to death to talk about him. And when Jack Alexander was writing the famous Saturday Evening Post article, Bill said, "I wish we could avoid mentioning the Oxford Group situation." Well, that's just about the way it is in AA today. Mention the Oxford Group and make sure you give 12 reasons why we left them. But just before Buchman died, Bill said he said this: "Where did we get moral inventory, amends for harms done, turning our will and our lives over to God, prayer and meditation, and all the rest of it?" We got it from the Oxford Group. The Language of the Heart, page 198. So, it took Bill a long time to get away from fear of the Roman Catholic criticism of the Oxford Group and to get away from his own resentments and so forth. And Dr. Bob never said words like that. Once he wrote and said, "We are now free of the shackles of the Oxford Group." What did he mean? Well, everybody was bugging him about it. And so Clarence left and took the people up to Cleveland and formed the first, quote, AA group. And Dr. Bob continued right along. And they're still talking about the four absolutes in a lot of the Midwestern meetings. Now, what about the Oxford Group? What was it? Boy, you can get more misinformation about that. There's a new book out here, Practicing the Principles or something or another. And everybody takes a segment of the Oxford Group or somebody else's statement of what the Oxford Group is, and then that becomes the Oxford Group. And again, I like to complicate things. They never are simple. And there are 28 Oxford Group principles that impacted on AA, and 200 expressions from the Oxford Group, and I'll read you some of them, that you would recognize in a minute. They're in the big book. So it isn't easy to describe the Oxford Group influence. Therefore, it isn't easy to dismiss it, if you're being honest. The Oxford Group, rightly or wrongly, permeated the AA program, and it still does. That's why this guy wrote this book called AA Cult or Cure. And his big beef is with the Oxford Group, and he says AA just is a cult, and he says it's not a cult, but he goes on to all these things and just writes it as if AA were all Oxford Group. And he never mentioned the Bible, so I wrote him a letter, and he wrote a revised edition and quotes me, but I never wanted to take a look at the quote. I don't know what he says. Okay, so what did we get from the Oxford Group that came from the Bible? Well, about God. God is the Creator, Maker, Father, and Almighty. God has a plan. Man's chief end is to conform to that plan, and it starts with believing that God is. From Hebrews 11:6, God either is or He isn't, said Shoemaker, and says our big book. What God? Well, they told us what God. The Creator. I think it's used 12 times in the big book. Not a bulldozer. And Maker and Father. And the Maker is not Henry Ford. It's not a car. The Maker is the guy that made Henry, who made the Ford. And Father and Almighty and so forth. So, Shoemaker's thesis was that man suffered from spiritual misery. And eventually Bob and Bill came to believe that, particularly Bob, that he used to emphasize much more that alcoholism was a spiritual disease. And you notice the part of the big book that picks up on this and says, when the spiritual malady is overcome, he straightens out mentally and physically. So the job became to find out what was wrong with the alcoholic other than alcohol. And the big book says the bottles are just a symbol. Liquor is but a symptom. A symptom of what? Well, according to the Oxford Group thesis, sin. What is sin? Well, they had a very simple theology. They didn't even refer to the Bible. They said it's anything that blocks us from God or from another man. And then they said, we have to remove the big I. You have to crucify the big I. The sin was the big I. I won't say the big dick, but the point is it's the big I. I. And AA picked up on that. Biggest part of the third step is the decision to quit playing God. And so this was the start of it, and it came from the Oxford group. Sin. What was blocking us from God was our own egos, our own self, our own desire to play God, and that had to be eliminated. And certainly the Bible was about eliminating sin. And Buchman had a lot of simple little expressions like, the problem is sin, the solution is Jesus Christ, and the result is a miracle. He had a lot of these little glib sayings, and that was the thesis for getting rid of sin, the sin that stood in the way of the Maker. How did you eliminate the sin? Well, you stood at the turning point, said Shoemaker. Self-surrender has always been and always must be regarded as the vital turning point of the religious life. Doesn't say spiritual life, says religious life. So far as the religious life is spiritual and no affair of outer works and ritual and sacraments. If you want to buy something about religion and spiritual, you might just pick up on the fact that some religion is all too concerned with sacraments and outer works and ritual. And Shoemaker was trying to get at the heart of it and saying, it's self-surrender. I don't know whether I agree with that thesis or not, but that was the underlying idea of AA. You had to surrender. And he says, one may say that the whole development of Christianity in inwardness has consisted in little more than the greater and greater emphasis attached to the crisis of self-surrender. So what did we get there? Well, in addition to a lot of specific language, the third step surrender idea came from the idea that you're never going to get back to God, you're never going to find God until you surrender yourself. And the power was Jesus Christ. And you got that power, they said, by making a decision to surrender. Thy will be done. Then you had to change your life. And the art of changing lives was called soul surgery, which they used to talk about in old AA. And what did that mean? Cutting out sin. And by cutting out sin, they didn't mean knock it off. They meant it's hard to get rid of it. And so you've made a decision, step 3, and now you've got to cut that stuff out. And how do you do that? Well, you did that through the 5 C's. The first C was confidence. And I love doing this with a newcomer. He's not going to tell you anything. He's not going to tell you he just robbed a bank or was a felon or was in the nut house or doesn't have a driver's license until you tell him that you did a few of those things. You have to gain his confidence. And this is our great strength in Alcoholics Anonymous. We got the whole idea from the Oxford group. And we still use it, if we're going to use it at all. Many of us lie. Isn't that incredible? I mean, we lie to the probation officer, to the judge, to the lawyer, to the doctor, to the psychiatrist. And the thesis in AA and from the Oxford group is that the easiest way to keep people from lying is to tell them about yourself and gain their confidence, the first C. If you want to work with a newcomer, you could preach to him, as Bill often did, and you get no place. He doesn't want to hear how bad he is. He already knows. What he is interested in sometimes is finding out how bad you are. And that builds confidence, first C. The second C is get him to confess it. Dr. Bob said, they all said we bit our fingernails. And Dr. Bob said, I'm a secret drinker. That was a big deal for him. He was the town's doctor, and he thought highly of himself. I don't think anybody else did, but he did. He didn't want to admit it. So he not only admitted to the fact that he was an alcoholic, but hopefully somewhere along the line he told Bill a few goodies. We've never heard that, I guess, because Bill kept the confidence. So the confession was the second aspect. And there's a lot of nonsense about open confession and closed confession and stuff like that. But it came from James 5:16, confess your faults one to another, and pray for one another that you may be healed. So the second thing was, after you've gained somebody's confidence, do step 5, if you will. Confess it. And they used the language, admitted to God and to another human being. And the third C was step 6, conviction. Okay, so you told me you were a thief. You want to quit? A lot of us don't want to quit, But and then Bill put in a very valuable part that says we claim spiritual progress, not spiritual perfection. And my sponsee Bob is still trying to baffle me with be therefore perfect. Even of course, I'm perfect, so I'm not baffled by that. But the issue is you're not going to change at all until you're convinced that you have been separated from God, that you need Him, you want to find Him, and there's a wall. This is Oxford Group talk. Then conversion. You can't climb the wall by yourself. The fourth C. You surrender, God changes you. A very profound thought. And then the big deal. Most of AA is about the fifth C, continuance. What do? Well, we take the first 9 steps, and then we continue. What do we continue in? We continue cutting out sin, only we do it daily. Some of us not very well. And what else do? We enhance our communication with God. We've surrendered to Him. Now we've got to talk to Him. And so the 11th step, a lot of it is about talking to God, learning more about God, and when you're in stress, calling Him off the bench, getting Him into the game. And what else? Carrying the message, fellowshipping with like-minded believers, winners we call them in AA, and practicing the principles. That's the continuance. And is it going to hurt anybody to know that? Why call Frank Buchman a Nazi and a homosexual? A lot of people are having problems with sex these days. In the White House and elsewhere. But my point is, putting labels on people doesn't negate the basic issues, and that is, you got to continue to grow. And the Oxford Group had a bunch of stuff that came from the Bible about growth, prayer, listening to God, studying the Bible, and so on. That's what's important, not the Oxford Group, but the principles that AA picked up on and used, and uses to this very day. It's the heart of our steps. You can't bury the Oxford Group. One guy said something about, well, we got out of bed with those fellows a long time. This is a major historian in AA and a former staff person. We got out of bed with those fellows. What do we want to get back into bed with them for? I don't want to get into bed with the Oxford Group. It doesn't exist. But I do think we ought to know these things so that we have a little understanding of confidence. You'll be a better sponsor if you understand what you're supposed to do with a newcomer. You're supposed to gain his confidence. Otherwise, he'll lie to you. He's lied to everybody else. And there's a technique, and it's set forth in the big book. And it came from the Oxford Group. That chapter, Working with Others, is cool. It just has some great stuff about how to work with somebody else. How they'll con you, how you have to guard your time carefully and move on if they're conning you. Great stuff in there. And it has to do with this whole process of winning confidence, the first C. Not going to change anybody's life if you don't get their confidence. And then having gotten their confidence, you got to get them to admit. The recovery centers spend a lot of their time with getting over denial. I remember I used to go down and talk about God for about 3 years, and they finally threw me out. They didn't want to hear about God. They'd rather deal with denial. Well, that's only the second step, if you will. Admitting that you got a problem isn't solving it. May be an important part of the process. Conviction, I got to change. Conversion, God's got to help me. Continuance, it's not a one-shot deal. It goes on. And those are just solid AA ideas. Restitution or amends. Where did that come from? Nobody in my church just a plain old community church. I supposed Protestant, and they didn't much care what you believed. But nobody ever told me to go out and straighten things out. Jesus did, but my minister did. I think he was more interested in getting me out of the church, and he succeeded by my will, not his. And so the Oxford group was big on restitution. And AA today has a hard time with that because, it was one thing for Bill to say to Lois that he'd cheated a few times, but you get a sponsee that comes in and he's burglarized 150 homes on Maui and dealt drugs for 10 years and hasn't got a driver's license and never had insurance and hasn't filed a tax return. You go out and tell him, surrender, admit all. We'll never see him again. Somebody tried to baffle a guy at the Seattle convention with that, and some newcomer was going to hold forth all the news, and the guy says, I have sponsees that are drug dealers. And so this guy up on the stage, tell them to go and confess it all, and guys that I have out there always want to pay the drug dealer back. And I said, how about paying your child support first? Paying the drug dealer is illegal. And then this old timer got up there and he says, give me that microphone. His name was Cease, kind of a kindly old guy from Canada. And he says, go to your lawyer. Why should we be amateurs performing difficult professional tasks? Chimes have changed. We are a drug-saturated society today. That's why we have drug courts, is the judges have finally decided there's no point in punishing these people. They keep coming back and coming back and coming back, and they're sicker than dogs. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know whether it's going to work or not, but the idea of the drug court is we are sick, not we ought to be punished. They found out that doesn't work. And part of AA's and the Bible's and the Oxford group thesis was, if you want to get over being sick, just go and straighten out your life. You're free. You're free. Thank God you're free. And you are. I had to do a lot of amends. One of them involved 33 days in state prison. I'm not planning on going back there. I learned my lesson. And I feel free. And guys that haven't filed a tax return for 10 years will come to me. And the first thought is fear. I'm not going to file any tax return. I said, let's go to the tax lawyer. He'll cheat for you. No, I'm kidding. But, this is a complicated deal. And we've done this several times where you go and they wind up getting a refund. Fear is the biggest problem that they face. And the fear stops them. And the restitution or the amend frees them. It doesn't free them spiritually. It gives us another step along the way of continuance. Then daily surrender. Don't just do it once. Promptly make amends. It's just wonderful to get your amends out of the way if you ever do. And then say, now I'm free. I can step on people's toes all I want to. Maybe the mark of the old-timer who's still suffering is that he's still stepping on toes and thinks he's free. No, it's a daily process. That's why the 10th step is so beautiful. And the Oxford group saw it that way. It doesn't end when you've made the original amends. That's just learning how to make amends promptly. And then quiet time. We've already discussed that. It was a whole process of growing and communion with and keeping in contact with God. And we see Oxford group language, and if I have time, you'll see the actual language almost sounds like our 11th-step language, sought through prayer and meditation and so forth. And there's a phrase from Stephen Foote's Life Began Yesterday that reads almost identically with that language, just as there's language from Shoemaker's book about the 3rd step that says we've made a decision to cast my will and my life on God. We haven't escaped the Oxford group. We've codified it. We've incorporated it. And so let's learn a little bit about it. Then spiritual awakening. That expression was used all the time in the Oxford group. You will gain a spiritual awakening when you change your life and find out that God can and has done for you what you couldn't do for yourself. Well, I struggled with that for a long time. What is a spiritual awakening? Don't ever bring the topic up in an AA meeting unless you plan on spending a long time and hearing a lot of baloney. People have a hard time with these steps because they haven't a clue what they mean. And it's not discussed in the big book. It's all over the big book, and it's mostly about consciousness of the power and presence of God in our lives. When I say that at a meeting, because that for me is the spiritual awakening, I'm conscious that God has been at work in my life when I turn to Him. That's my spiritual awakening, and it's all over the big book. But it's a tough topic because it doesn't happen to be connected with the 12-step discussion in the big book. And pass it on. It was a witnessing technique. Frank Buchman of the Oxford Group said, you got to pass it on. How are you going to get away from that? You're going to say we got it from Noah's Ark? No, we got it from Frank Buchman, who said you got to pass it on. And then this strange little AA expression, you got to give it away to keep it. Ann Smith wrote that in her journal. Sam Shoemaker wrote it in 4 or 5 different books that he wrote. You got to give it away to keep it. What does that mean? If you want to keep the spiritual awakenings, keep your contact with God alive, you've got to be active in moving His Word, telling the message. The gospel, the so-called good news, was not about reading the newspaper and putting it down. It was about reading the newspaper and passing it on, figuratively speaking. Okay. Now, the fun part for me, since I'm kind of a screwball, is that just as you can pick, after you've spent 8 years doing this, just as you can pick the Bible verses that really relate, and here I want to say that my books still haven't arrived from United Airlines. I hope somebody hears that tape someday that's a drunken United Airlines, preferably not piloting the plane. But there's a newsletter which I don't have any direct connection with, but it's back on the table. And whether or not those syllabuses arrive, in that is a little statement, a little pamphlet, and I plan to have one on each phase of this later on. But it's the Bible verses that directly underlie the steps. It's what we covered this morning. So feel free, if you want to pick up that newsletter and take it with you. It's back on the round table in the back. And I don't have a pamphlet for this, but it's in some of my books, and I'm trying to get it shorter and shorter. But just listen to this. Just as you can pull Bible verses now and identify them with each of the steps, and you can find that identification in my books or in this syllabus or in the little pamphlet back there, so too can you do it with the Oxford Group principles. You don't have to say we got our ideas from the 5 C's and the 4 absolutes and the 4 practical principles and the 4 spiritual activities and all this junk. Let's make it real. What did we get from the Oxford Group? Oh, God, manage me because I can't manage myself. That's what we got from the Oxford Group, and it got put in step 1. We admitted that our lives had become unmanageable. The original first step was we admitted we were licked. And Ann Smith wrote in her book, and Frank Buchman had a thing called the Victor Story, and Sam Shoemaker had Charlie's Prayer, and it was all the same thing. Oh, God, manage me because I can't manage myself. And boy, that was very real. You know, people came in and their lives were a mess. And part of the initial admission was, I'm licked. I can't manage it anymore, God. You please manage me. And all that figurative stuff, you know, He's the Father, we're the children, He's the principal, we're the agent. Bill kind of got into a little lost stuff there. But it still gets down to the unmanageable life, and we got it from the Oxford Group. Period. That's where we got it. Step 2. Guess who wrote A Power Greater Than Ourselves? Sam Shoemaker. He wrote of the need for a force outside himself, greater than himself, a vast power outside of themselves. He insisted that there be a willingness to believe and a belief in God, and the willingness, he said, was wrapped up in an experiment of faith. If you were willing, meaning get off your duff and do it, if you were willing to follow God's will, you'd find out what God's will was. You'd have a greater understanding of God. and you would come to believe in a force outside of himself, greater than himself. And believe me, the Reverend Canon Samuel Moore Shoemaker Jr., D.D., S.T.D., was not talking about a bulldozer. This was a man of the church. He was not talking about a light bulb or the group. When he was talking with his vestments on and having Bill carry a sign around in New York City down to Madison Square, Jesus Christ changes lives, he was not talking about a bulldozer. The force or power greater than himself has roots, folks. It has roots. It's not some nebulous thing. It was Shoemaker's way of moving people forward. You don't have any power. Your life is unmanageable. You need a power greater than yourself. And guess who he is? Well, you're at step 3. May you find him now. Okay. Now the big one, the fun thing. I said this in Pittsburgh in front of the jailer, the judge, a bunch of therapists, and a lot of practical guys in the probation office. And one of them came up and said, I didn't know that. And I said, nobody does. We've invented a God in AA because nobody understands where we came from. The Oxford group itself laid the foundation for the idea in step 3 that we start with a decision. And in Twice Born Ministers, Sam Shoemaker said he needed to make the decision to cast my will and my life on God. How close can you get? If you were plagiarizing, you'd quote it verbatim, and Bill changed a couple of words, and I don't think he was quoting it. I think Bill was hearing it all the time. That's the kind of stuff you heard constantly in the meetings. Then Shoemaker forecast and framed the famous God as we understood him. Maybe the reason I'm not so popular is because I'm an iconoclast. Jim B. was always saying he invented the phrase God as we understood him. He didn't. He wasn't even there when they adopted that expression. They objected to the fact that Bill had used the word God 400 times, and Bill, in his good lawyer-like compromising manner, listened to these guys. And John Henry Fitzhugh Mayo was saying, we got to tell it like it is. It's Christian and it's from the Bible. And Hank Parkhurst, that everybody calls an atheist, and he wasn't, he was an Oxford group man, says, nah, and because he was on the same company that Bill was, selling stock in the big book. And we want this to be a psychological work. Was he an atheist? I couldn't care less, but I can tell you this. Bill said he was an atheist. At the same time, he was in the Oxford group. Now, you figure that one out. But he did want to sell big books. That's for sure. And what happened is they had this so-called battle in Ruth Hawk's office. And we don't know who invented, if you will, the expression God as we understood him. But I can tell you that Jimmy B. did not, because he wasn't there. And if anybody might have invented it, it might have been John Henry Fitzhugh Mayo, the son of the Episcopalian minister. But I think Bill came up with something that he heard very clearly many times in Shoemaker's book. Surrender, and it's in Children of the Second Birth twice, and it's in many of Shoemaker's writings. Surrender as much of yourself as you understand to as much of God as you understand. Gosh, isn't that simple? How many of you here would like to get up at this microphone and explain God? May I see a raise? I wouldn't. There's a lot I don't know about God. But do I believe in him? You bet your boots. Did that Jewish guy with whom I had lunch today believe in God? You bet your boots. He said he did. I don't have a problem with that. Is his understanding of God the same as mine? I doubt it. But when it gets right down to it, does he believe that God was the creator? Probably. The maker? Probably. Father? He might have some problem with that, but I can't know why a Jew would. They were God's chosen people. And so, each of us surrenders, said Shoemaker, as much of ourselves as we do understand, to as much of God as we understand. God doesn't make us take an examination in theology to turn our will and our lives over to His care. And so, when you say that to people, then all the gobbledygook gets out of it. Now, if some Hindu wants to make up that God, as he understands Him, is a golden idol or Buddha or whatever he wants, I couldn't care less. I'm glad to see he's blessed. But if we want to know where it came from the Oxford Group. And they were talking about God Almighty and said you don't have to have a vast understanding of Him. You just have to make a surrender to Him. And they had another similar phrase, which was surrender as much of yourself as you know, to as much of God as you know. And that was used an equal number of times. So much for that one. Step 4. The Oxford Group was always talking about make the moral test. What did they mean? Put down your good points? Heavens, no. They were talking about put down your bad points. The so-called true inventory that Joe and Charlie talk about was the truth about your immorality. And how did you test that? Well, you wrote down the 4 absolutes: honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. And next to them you said, in this area, I was not absolutely loving. In this area, and I think Bill never wanted to cover this particular column, I was absolutely impure in the following areas. And dishonest. And we do pretty much the same thing today when we do the 4th step. We write down where we fell short of standards. Only today, and these are also biblical, resentment, fear, self-seeking, resentment, dishonesty, self-seeking, and fear came from the Oxford Group. And Bill just changed them. He didn't like the 4 absolutes because he thought that would offend the Roman Catholics, I guess. Except it didn't. There's a cardinal that speaks all the time about the importance of the 4 absolutes. But whatever it is, it was changed to these other things, but it was just write them down. Write down where your life follows short. And then Buchman also said, moral recovery starts when everyone admits his own faults instead of spotlighting the other fellows. And that's what we do. Look for your part, says the 4th step. Step 5. Confession. Oxford Group writer said, the first step for me was to be honest with God, and the next to be honest with men. And another Oxford Group writer who wrote about the 5 C's said, be ready to confess your own shortcomings honestly and humbly. That language can be found virtually verbatim in the big book. Step 6. In The Venture of Belief, one of Shoemaker's sidekicks, a professor, wrote this: to summarize the various stages of spiritual adventure, first, the will to believe, step 2. Second, the honest facing and sharing of all conscious sin, step 4. Third, the complete surrender of self to God, step 3. And fourth, the willingness to obey His will. The willingness to obey His will, step 6. Step 7. In I Was a Pagan, Bill Wilson's friend, an Oxford Group writer, Victor Kitchen, said, it takes the power of God to remove the desire for these indulgences. That's almost verbatim language. And Kitchen also said, I then and there admitted my inability to quit of my own will and asked God to take charge of the matter. And he also said, God satisfied unsound desire by removing the desire itself. Where do we get this expression, remove my shortcomings? From the Oxford Group. Step 8. You've got to be willing to make amends. God cannot take over my life unless I'm willing, said Cecil Rose, an Oxford Group writer. Oxford Group writer Jack Winslow said, a further point in the moral challenge which the Oxford Group presents is known as restitution, viz., putting right, as far as in our power, wrongs committed in the past. Step 9. These first steps of restitution are absolutely necessary if I am to start the new life clear with God and with other people. Remember, in the 9th step discussion, our main task is to be of maximum service to God and those about us. The great task that is waiting cooperate with God and ask God to make us fit for Him to use. That's when man listens. Step 10, Shoemaker wrote, there is need for rededication day by day, hour by hour, by which progressively, in every quiet time, the contaminations of sin and self-will. I wonder if Shoemaker got that out of the Big Book. No. Bill Wilson got it out of the Conversion of the Church. Sin and self-will are further sloughed off, for they do have a way of collecting. And using language which AA seems to have adopted verbatim, Frank Buchman said, what is the disease? Isn't it fear, dishonesty, resentment, and selfishness? The exact words we use in the Big Book in connection with Step 11 and Step 10. Remaking the World, page 38. Step 11. Cecil Brown wrote, well, that's not right. My goodness, I made a mistake. The venture of... It wasn't Cecil Brown. It was Philip Marshall Brown. For heaven's sakes. They tell of the strength of heart and mind, of the depth of knowledge of life, of the charity and love that are poured into human beings whenever they establish contact with God. Ever hear that phrase? Of course you do. It's the 11th-step language. And Stephen Foote said, contact with God is the necessary fundamental condition, and that is made through prayer and listening. Sought through prayer and meditation, blah, blah, blah. I will ask God to show me His purpose for my life and claim from Him the power to carry that purpose out. How close can you get to the Big Book language? Why, Stephen Foote must have gotten it from the Big Book. No, he wrote this in 1934, and there wasn't any Big Book. So where did the Big Book get it? You decide. Victor Kitchen, I emerged into God consciousness. That word I use a lot of times in the Big Book. Step 12. Walder wrote in Soul Surgery, and that was the first Oxford Group book. The basis of conversion is the awakening of a new self, and the vital element in this new birth is the dawning of a new affection which dominates the heart. There's a good definition for spiritual awakening. Shoemaker said, the experience which I consider was my conversion brought to me a new kind of life, which was entirely new to me. This guy at the lunch table today, he's Jewish, and he's quoting Shoemaker and not knowing it. And I hope he does know it when he leads. He said he had a new life. Sure, we do. And then Frank Buchman wrote, the best way to keep an experience of Christ is to pass it on. And as to practicing the principles, A.J. Russell, who wrote For Sinners Only, said, moreover, it meant a relentless crusade to induce other men and women not only to believe in the possibility of living the victorious life, but to live it. And Streeter, who wrote The God Who Speaks, says, Christ does not merely teach men what to do, He gives them the power to do it. Now, if I haven't convinced you, you can just read the revision of the Oxford Group, which just came out, or you can read Turning Point if you own it, and you'll see 200 expressions that are from Oxford Group and Shoemaker books, and man, they're a dead ringer for Big Book language, and I not only quote the Oxford Group source, but the Big Book source. And let's just I just open it up to this. Item 178. Let go. Abandon yourself to Him. Why, they must have gotten that from the Big Book. No, it was written before the Big Book. That's in Shoemaker, Religion That Works, page 19. In this book, it's 703. And in the Big Book, it says, abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Spirit of the universe. Ever hear that one? Why, they must have gotten it from the Big Book. No, they got it from A Fool Hath Said. Page 28. And on and on and on. And somewhere a great reality is born, which brings a new discovery of God and new tides of life. foot. Life began yesterday. And you can take these things, and I suspect if I had enough time and enough years, I could find perhaps another 50 that are in AA language and are right out of the Oxford group. Now, what's the point of all this? Well, the point of all this is to stop saying that Frank Buchman was a Nazi and a homosexual and say, I don't care what he was or what his sexual orientation was, and the Oxford group people claim it's baloney anyway. What do we care about that? What we care about is understanding a little bit better what we're talking about when we are using these expressions by going back to their source. I learned quite some time ago that Albert Einstein was possibly the father of our atom bomb, but I think I learned before that he said E equals mc squared. Anybody want to come up here and talk about that? I haven't a clue, And if I were to want to know what that meant, if I were to try to impress somebody and he was drunk in a bar, I'd say, did you know that Einstein invented the theory of relativity, E equals mc squared? No, but yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, I don't have to explain it. Gosh, we're sober. And if I tried to baffle you with that, you'd probably say, Dick, you're full of baloney. What does that mean? What does that mean? Where did it come from? It's no use to me. And so, if we want to be good messengers, it's no point in just talking about God as we understand Him as a rocket. We got to understand that the decision to cast my will and my life on God has some origins. And was refreshing to me. You can't give your will to God. He gave you free will. That's the essence of our life on this earth. It's one of the reasons we get into so much trouble. We have a choice. And when we become an alcoholic, we lose the choice. We're in the grips of an obsession which deprives us of free choice. So if we're going to talk about these things like, I gave my will to God, well, it was the wrong God. That's your problem. And if you want to line yourself up with God's will and gain His power, you'll get someplace, said the early AAs. So, and I submit that I don't have a problem with the Oxford group. And somebody said, what are they today and where are they and so forth? Are you going to cover that? And since I got a second or two here, I will. The Oxford group can't be pinpointed at any particular time because it was founded by Frank Buchman, who was a Lutheran minister who never did much ministering. He had a church for about a year, and then he got interested in witnessing, and he got tangled up with the YMCA and went abroad, and little by little he picked up some ideas, and one of them was that the will of God was an extremely important thing. Another one was that quiet time was an extremely important thing. And then he developed this so-called art of life changing, the 5 C's. And then in 1919, he and Howard Walter and Henry Wright, a professor at Yale, were going to write a book called Soul Surgery. And the boys all died, and the parents printed it. And so little by little, if you want to talk about the Oxford group, for heaven's sakes, don't talk about what this book talks about. What is the Oxford group? The book was not written by an Oxford group person. Is it useful? Yes. Is it accurate? Pretty much so. But as one of the Oxford group people in England told me, it was just one tool. Now, it happened that Dr. Bob used that tool, but he also used For Sinners Only, which was the key Oxford group book. Soul Surgery, I found it in Ann Smith's journal, the actual book in it. And so they used not just What is the Oxford group that was not written by an Oxford grouper. Dr. Bob said, I read everything they had to offer. And he was able to distill, and Bill was listening to everything they had to offer. He probably didn't need to read Sam Shoemaker's books. He listened to Sam all the time, and he heard this stuff. And so the real key to understanding the Oxford group is to understand that Bookman pulled together from some ancient sources, if you will, Dwight Moody, the famous evangelist, F.B. Meyer, a famous congregational minister, several Roman Catholic sources, St. Augustine, Brother Lawrence, practicing the presence of God, St. Thomas à Kempis. The Oxford group ideas were drawn by Frank Bookman from a number of sources, and if you want to know what they are, they're in both my book, The Good Book and the Big Book, and also in the Oxford group. No, they're not in the Good Book and the Big Book. They're in the Oxford group in Alcoholics Anonymous and in Turning Point. So, about the 1919s, a group of friends started calling this a first century Christian fellowship. And why did they call it that? Because they tried to emulate the early Christians in the book of Acts. They fellowshiped together daily. They studied scriptures. They broke bread together. They prayed together. That was first century Christianity. And so they called themselves a first century Christian fellowship. Years later, Dr. Bob was to call AA a Christian fellowship. Well, after that, people began calling them the groups, and that's where we got our groups, because there was more than one group. And then in 1928, for no particularly good reason, 7 Oxford group people were traveling on a train in South Africa, and for no particularly good reason, the journalists started calling them the Oxford group. Were they from Oxford? No. But 6 of them were. And it was kind of convenient. Oh, that car over there, that's the Oxford group. And they put a sign on it to identify them, just like you all got signs. And that's all there is to the Oxford group. And people just love to say Frank Bookman had nothing to do with Oxford University. That's true. So what? A bunch of newspaper reporters gave it that name. And did Frank Bookman later have anything to do with Oxford University? Only in the sense that 3 distinguished theologians there began to write books about the Oxford group ideas. Streeter was a famous Bible scholar, and he wrote The God Who Speaks. And a guy wrote The Person of Christ, Grenstead. And another one, Thornton Dewsbury. These guys were the equivalent of chancellors or particular parts of Oxford University. But Bookman didn't have anything to do with the Oxford University. And then about in 1938, the war clouds were coming. And there was a group at Oxford that were very much opposed to the war. And they said, I will not fight for God or my king. I will not fight for my king or my country. So pacifism was becoming very unpopular as Hitler became more and more of a threat. And so about that time, Bookman decided there's a war coming and we've got to morally rearm. And so he launched what he called moral rearmament because he didn't particularly want it to be associated with the name Oxford, which was becoming pacifist. Then what happened? Well, in 1941, for reasons somewhat obscure, Sam Shoemaker kicked Frank Bookman and his group out of Calvary House in New York. And why? There are a lot of good guesses. The main one was that Frank had virtually taken over Calvary Church. Boy, their newsletter was all about the Oxford group, and their sermons were all about the Oxford group. And I imagine about that time, according to Shoemaker's daughters, Frank said to Sam, I want you to leave your church and we're going to go for world changing. And Sam was a church man. And he said, no dice. I'm not leaving the Episcopal Church. And he tried thereafter to become a bishop and this and that and the other thing. And so he disassociated himself from the Oxford group. And there were bad feelings. Bad feelings. And some of them still exist. And I've been exposed to them. But the bad feelings were just personal stuff. And most of the Oxford group people, like Jim Houck, who came here, went with the Oxford group. And very few went with Sam Shoemaker. Now, those are the facts, if you want them, for what they're worth. And that was the Oxford group. What happened to it? Well, it went on to reconcile France and Germany after World War I. It did a great deal in Japan, in Brazil, in India. Buchmann was nominated 2 or 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize, and then he had a stroke. And after a while, the Oxford group just died. It just didn't exist. It existed in England, but not here. So a group of people, including Jim Houck, who was sitting here 3 weeks ago, reformed moral rearmament. And believe me, folks, it's very, very different today from what it was. And it's not very strong. There aren't many people. And I know the original survivors, and they're jewels, really nice people, including Jim. They're just the salt of the earth. But today, the Oxford group is involved in several issues, like racial questions in the South, and a few things overseas, and not much else. There are no more Oxford groups meeting and doing Bible study. And when you read their literature, and I do, I get it sent to me all the time, there's no talk about Jesus Christ. At the upcoming thing this August, they will have the Dalai Lama, the rabbi from London, the Cardinal Koenig from Austria, and a bunch of American businessmen. This was not the Oxford group. They were about, at first, life-changing, individual lives. So, for what it's worth, that's the Oxford group today, and it's no secret. You can send to their offices in Washington, D.C., and the address is listed in my Oxford group book. Because every now and then people get so turned on with the Oxford group, they'll say to me, I want to form an Oxford group. What do I do? And I say, well, good luck. There aren't any anymore, but if you want to write and get some literature, write to Moral Rearmament, Washington, D.C. on 15th Street, and go for it if you want to. And old Jim is still honking away here. He's one of those fortunate people that still has pretty doggone good health, and he's a marvelous man. And so, he's still talking about the Oxford group and some of the ideas, and unfortunately, they seduced him into talking about Akron, and he doesn't know what he's talking about because he never had anything to do with the Oxford group in Akron. He said, I think he said that AA was formed in 1938 and blah, 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 blah. And it's like any of us. We're fine as long as we stick to our own knowledge and experience, but if we try to become experts in everything, we sadly fail, and it isn't long before somebody finds it out. So that's the story of the Oxford group for what it's worth, and I think you can find in my book about 25 footnotes that will verify that. Let's take a break and come back happy, happy, happy.